The National Broadcasting Company and the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, in cooperation with the American Political Science Association and the National Council for the Social Studies, present Continental Classroom, a course in the structure and functions of American government. Conducted by Dr. Peter H. Odegard, Professor of Political Science at the University of California in Berkeley. Professor Odegard.
The other day we saw that the founding fathers of the American Constitution took a rather dim view of democracy, at least democracy as they understood it, which was the kind of democracy that they saw in ancient Athens. I suggested at that time that had the founding fathers taken a closer look at Athens, they might have found more to their liking there than they indicated in what they've written. They might have found, for example, that even within Athens there was the germ of a representative system in their Council of 500. They might have found, too, that their fear of a totalitarian attitude toward government in which everything was subject to control of the assembly was not quite true in practice, as any careful reading, for example, of Pericles' great funeral oration would have indicated, and so on and so on and so on. They might have found more in Athens to their liking than they did. But I'm not so sure this would have made any difference in the development of American government, because governments do not grow from theoretical blueprints. They grow from the history, kind of ideas, the general culture of a people. They grow in a certain kind of physical environment, and they're very much the result of historical accidents. And in the case of the American system of government, it's the result of the interplay in these very early days, in the 18th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the interplay of the needs of the British Empire and the autonomy, the independence, the isolation, if you please, of the American colonies. And within the American system over here, you have to take account of the social heritage of the American people, as we pointed out, the fact that we were a nation of dissenters, the fact that we resolved what I've called this transcendental paradox, this conflict between the covenant of grace and the covenant of works, take account of the character of the 40 million immigrants that poured into this country, poor people of humble origin, take account of the fact that no one was ever successful in establishing a rigidly stratified system of society. We tried it in New York for a while in the feudal patroon system. We tried it in the South. The first died with the Revolution. The second died with the Civil War. And all of these factors, it seems to me, bear immediately and directly upon the development of American political institutions. I think we need to take account also of something we're likely to forget, and that is that the basic development of American political institutions took place in the 17th and 18th centuries, a period known in history and intellectual history as the period of the Enlightenment, a great period when ideas, new philosophies, new theories of men and mankind were burgeoning all over the world, a period that was characterized by the writings of such people as Voltaire, Diderot in France, Condillac, Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, John Locke, and even old Thomas Hobbes. The tremendous intellectual activity focused on the problems of power and on the problems of the organization of government generally. All of these things, together with the physical environment of the American people, this vast continent, empty of people, except for a few Stone Age savages, all of this contributed to the development of American government. So too, did certain accidents of history. I mentioned before the defeat of the Spanish Armada. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, before there was any English colony established in the American continent, nevertheless had a profound effect upon the development of our institutions, because it meant that we would get our institutions from the English rather than the Spanish. And I'm not suggesting that one is better than the other. I'm merely suggesting that it did make a great difference in our development. Also, I think the fact that the English succeeded in defeating the French in Quebec and took over at the Treaty of Paris the French possessions in the North American continent also meant that the French influence upon American politics and government would be reduced. Other accidents, like Napoleon's financial straits in 1800, which impelled him to sell to Jefferson this vast tract of land in the so-called Louisiana Purchase. All of this contributed immensely and directly to the development of American government. And finally, it seems to me that one of the most important factors in the development of American political institutions was the problem that the British themselves faced in trying to solve what has come to be known as the imperial problem, the problem of empire. Now, the British might have done one of three things, or really one of two things. They might have developed an imperial parliament in which all of the colonies would have had direct representation in London, along with the English people, the American people, and so on, would have had representation in this imperial parliament. The British rejected this. This was proposed and declined. Secondly, they might have developed what came to be known later as the British Commonwealth of Nations. They might have let the American colonies grow to maturity and independence, and then kept them within the structure of the British Empire or the British Commonwealth, as they now keep India, Australia, Canada, and the other dominions, self-governing dominions, within the structure of the British Commonwealth of Nations. This they did not in the 18th century have the vision or the courage to undertake, although both plans were open to them. Instead, they denied representation in the imperial parliament. They failed to develop a Commonwealth of Free Nations and were faced inevitably with the problem of taxation, particularly taxation, because that's where it hurts, where government really hurts, without representation, and let themselves wide open for that most effective of all revolutionary cries, that taxation without representation is tyranny. The British might have avoided this, and it would have had a profound effect upon the development not only of our history, but of the history of the world. Now, the point I want to make is that American political institutions simply didn't grow or spring full-blown from some Jovian brow. Neither were they an inheritance in the sense that one thinks of somebody handing down an old bonnet. We did inherit, of course, 1,000 years of European history. But nevertheless, American political institutions took that history and adapted it to their own needs, and our institutions, I think, can be described essentially as indigenous to the American continent. Now, one other point I would make, and that is that the struggle for democracy in America was a struggle that was going on not only in America, but going on in other countries as well. And more particularly, for our purposes, was it going on in England. Many of the so-called rights of Englishmen were won in England at the same time that they were won in the American colonies. The struggle, for example, for a secularized parliamentary government in which the representatives of the people in Parliament would be supreme had its counterpart in the American colonies in the struggle against an established church, in the struggle between the colonial assemblies and the royal governor. These two went on together in England and in America at the same time. The dates of some of these historic rights of Englishmen are worth remembering because they point this out. The Petition of Right, for example, 1628. 1628 was 8 years after the founding of Plymouth Colony. Provided that taxes could be levied only with the consent of the people's representatives in Parliament. Provided protection against arbitrary imprisonment. Provided protection against the quartering of troops in private homes without the consent of the owner. All of these things, including the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, the Bill of Rights and the Toleration Act of 1689, all of these, I'm saying, became a part of the political ideology of America, not because we inherited them from England, but because we were part of the struggle by which they were won. And the guarantees of the Petition of Right, Habeas Corpus, and so on, you can find written into the Constitution of the United States, which the Supreme Court of the United States, today and tomorrow, will be called upon to apply and to construe. And so when the Supreme Court has to deal with cases involving these basic rights, they are dealing with cases that have their historic origin and lineage way back 300 years or more ago. Our colonial history paralleled and was part of the history of Europe, and especially of the history of England. Had it not been, for example, that James I, the first of the Stuarts, hadn't disliked Calvinists so much so, you know, that he said that Presbyterians agreeth as much with monarchy as the devil agreeth with God. And had James not said of the Calvinists, I will force them to conform, or I will harry them out of the kingdom. Had he not done this, you might have had a quite different development in America. Our history includes also the history of the persecution of Calvinists, so that this went on and on to a point where John Winthrop, whose picture you see here on this easel, decided in 1629 to leave England and come to Massachusetts Bay to establish there a new colony in the New World. I think we tend to forget that it was a Puritan party in Parliament that demanded that Charles I sign the Petition of Right in 1628. It was a Puritan, John Felton, who assassinated the Duke of Buckingham, who worked hand in glove with Bishop Laud in persecuting the Calvinists in England. So much so that John Felton became the toast of London. The point I want to make is that this was a thing that was felt on both sides of the Atlantic. People of London drank a toast to John Felton that went something like this: live ever, Felton, thou hast turned to dust treason, ambition, murder, pride, and lust. This for the assassination of the Duke of Buckingham. Well, in the New World, to which John Winthrop came, the Puritans' faith in themselves, and their intolerance of others, incidentally, was increased by Cromwell's rise to power in England. And I think we need to remember that we were part, in a sense, of this Cromwellian revolution. And you see Oliver Cromwell's picture here. We remember that it was Oliver Cromwell as the head of a Puritan government that put Charles I to death in one of the few instances in modern history in which the British had to resort to violence in the transfer of power. But note this also, this other theme that comes in from the colonies themselves. They loved Cromwell's triumph. They thought this is terrific. But then when they learned, after 1648, that Cromwell was building a new model army in which he was admitting not only Calvinists, but Baptists and Quakers and other people, because he needed soldiers. They repudiated this, said that Cromwell was indulging in pernicious errors, proceeded to tighten their own hold in Massachusetts, and broke off their relations with the Presbyterian Church in England. Thus, an act of independence, of which there were many that occurred during these years. Cromwell, someone says, had convinced the New England Puritans in the belief that in the entire world they alone were the true Calvinists, if not the true Christians. And so this intimate interaction between Europe and America went on for 150 years before the Declaration of Independence. It went on in the troubled years of James II. James II was a Catholic, and I can't here review his policies at home. But James II undertook to reorganize the colonies in America in 1686. He set up what was known as the Dominion of New England. He was going to do away with a lot of this independent nonsense. So he set up an organization under which all of the colonies of New England, including New York, Pennsylvania, would be united under a single governor appointed by the king. And he sent over a governor, first Governor Dudley, and later a very vigorous guy named Sir Edmund Andros, A-N-D-R-O-S. And Andros arrived in Boston in 1686 as the governor of the Dominion of New England. And he undertook almost immediately to order the abolition of the popular assemblies in all the colonies. He insisted that he had the right to tax by his own counsel and by his own authority. He insisted that they were going to re-examine all the land titles so that everybody, in order to get his land back, would have to pay a quit rent to the king. Well, this led, as you may remember, to a violent rebellion. The colonies at first sent Increase Mather, president of Harvard, to England to try to talk the king out of it, unsuccessfully. I suppose Increase Mather was one of the first of the eggheads to embark on an important diplomatic mission. But it led to open resistance at home. And we established in this country the first so-called Committee of Public Safety in 1689, 100 years before the French Committee on Public Safety. We called it the Council for the Safety and Conservation of Peace. And the revolution spread. We drove Andros out. And by this time, of course, events in England had changed, and James II was driven from the throne, to the great relief of everybody in England and in America, and was succeeded by William and Mary, who, as the choice of Parliament, became King and Queen of England by the grace of Parliament. But this didn't solve the imperial problem. And even the successors of William and Mary proceeded upon policies that were calculated to drive the Americans out of the empire. Trade and navigation requirements required them to bring non-English goods to England where they could collect a duty before they shipped them anywhere else. They set up a new board of trade and plantations to govern the colonies from London. And by this act, the British government rejected finally the idea of an imperial parliament and the possibility of creating a commonwealth of free nations, either of which might conceivably have saved the empire. Instead, Parliament and the Crown added insult to injury by establishing in America a series of admiralty courts before which colonial merchants could be tried without a jury when they were accused of violating these trade and navigation laws. Then they went beyond this. They prohibited the colonies from developing certain manufactures. They prohibited them from developing their own money. They tried to restrict the use of forest lands to the Imperial Navy, and so on and so on. In other words, they exhibited, in many ways, some of the worst features of what today is known as colonialism, treating the Americans as a source of raw materials, as a place to which they could sell goods and send their surplus population, but as people who had no right to govern themselves. This notwithstanding the fact that in England and in the colonies, practically every charter guaranteed to the Americans all of the rights of Englishmen. These were written into the charters. Even charters that would, for all practical purposes, kind of dictatorships, as they were originally in Virginia, New York, Carolinas, Georgia. But gradually, step by step, these charters, with their guarantee of the rights of Englishmen, were democratized. As early as 1618, a great charter of privileges, as it was called, was agreed to in Virginia. And in April 1619, a House of Burgesses was called into being, the first representative assembly in any English colony. And 2 years later, in 1621, an ordinance of Virginia established a two-chambered legislature, a council of state, a Supreme Council to advise the governor, and an assembly to represent the people. So too in Plymouth. In Plymouth, incidentally, unlike Massachusetts, the civil authorities were always in the saddle. A religious dictatorship that had developed for a while in Massachusetts did not develop in Plymouth. But even in Massachusetts, where you had this tight little oligarchical control of the church, had gradually to yield. It had to yield in 1631, it had to yield again in 1638, and finally in 1691, when they got a new charter, they had a new royal governor, and paradoxically, a much more democratic form of government. But the tide flowed much faster in other places. In Connecticut, where the fundamental orders of Connecticut established a representative assembly and a representative government for the towns in the Connecticut Valley, became perhaps the first written constitution in the history of the world to establish a government. And then there was Rhode Island, Providence, Plantations, as it was called in the beginning. A charter which was granted Williams in 1644 provided for government by the consent of the governed, separation of church and state, religious toleration, eligibility of everybody practically for public office, the protection of minorities, and yet with majority rule. And down below, we're developing the town meetings, a picture of which you see here, where the people of the town got together and in an assembly very much like that of ancient Athens, decided upon the policies under which they should live. As Williams wrote in 1654, 10 years after he'd gotten his charter, "We have long drunk," he said, "of the cup of as great liberties as any people under the whole heaven. We have not only been long free from the iron yoke of wolfish bishops, we have not felt the claims of Presbyterian tyrants, nor in this colony have we been consumed with the overzealous fire of so-called godly magistrates." All this he attributed to the democratic nature of their government. William Penn, in 1692, undertook, for example, to establish a government for West Jersey, which he had purchased from Lord Berkeley. And he said, "We lay a foundation for after ages to understand their liberty as men and Christians, that they may be brought under government only by their own consent, for we put the power in the people." It's rather interesting to observe that the language of Williams in 1644, 100 years before the Declaration of Independence, spoke of governments deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And so the democratic tide spread. It reached full tide at the time of the Revolution, as we'll see. But one aspect of this, I think, deserves special mention, and that is the tremendous contribution to democracy in America made by the Christian churches. The idea, for example, of the priesthood of all believers, every man his own priest, carried with it political overtones of individual rights and individual conscience that were very quickly translated into political terms. The organization of the churches themselves, where the churches and the church congregations got together and elected their own ministers and determined their own doctrine, became a kind of pattern for the town meeting in non-religious affairs. In 1772, for example, John Wise wrote his famous essay on the vindication of the government of the New England churches, in which he said, "The end of all government is to cultivate happiness," he said, "and promote the happiness of all. And it is as plain as day that there is no species of government like a democracy to attain this end." This essay on the government of the churches of New England by John Wise is a far cry from the early statements in New England that democracy, for example, was an instrument or a government of the devil. Great progress had been made through these years. And as Ernest Sutherland Bates has said in his book called American Faith, we do well to remember the contribution of these early church congregations to the development of democracy in this country. He says the ideal of local self-government was brought to America by the Pilgrims. The separation of church and state was derived from the Baptists. The right, that is particularly in Rhode Island, the right of free speech was a development of freedom of conscience established by Roger Williams and William Penn. The equality spoken of in the Declaration of Independence was the outgrowth of the equality preached by the Quakers. Democracy was envisaged, he said, in religious terms long before it assumed a political terminology. And thus, the foundations of American democracy are to be found in this interplay between the problems of the empire and the problems as the American settlers, the American colonists in this continent saw the problems in their own backyard. And finally, when it came to the Revolution, which gave much wider currency to all of these ideas, and which fanned the fires, if one may use this metaphor, the fires of democratic reform that were already started in nearly every colony, this revolution was a logical outgrowth of this twofold problem that I've talked about. The problem of the imperial problem, which the British, I think, never quite solved, and secondly, the problem of trying to resolve their own system of decision-making here. For John Adams knew that the American Revolution was a great deal more than a war for independence. "What do you mean by the Revolution?" he asked at the age of 80. "Do you mean the war with Britain?" It was only the effect and consequence of it. The Revolution, he said, was in the minds and hearts of the people before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington.
This has been a pre-recorded NBC educational production.